Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for being here and for sharing an hour or so of your afternoon with me, or evening now, I guess. I feel like with the time change, it still feels like it should be afternoon, even though the sun is most definitely setting in the window behind me. So I don't know about all of you, but time changes are always the most confusing for my mind. So I'm glad you all got here at the right time. And I'm just so excited to share some of my kind of favorite techniques for watercolor mountains with you. And the way this will work is that for the first like 45 minutes or so, I'm going to kind of run through just kind of a handful of techniques and ways of thinking about painting mountains, and so my favorite kind of tips and shortcuts for approaching mountain patterns. And then after that, I'll open up and you can all hop off mute at that point if you'd like during the Q&A, and I can answer questions and have a bit of a more chance to connect with everybody. Like I mentioned, we could have a pretty large group. We're sitting at about 40 right now, which is eminently reasonable. There are originally a couple hundred who signed up for this free workshop with me, which is just so fun. So whether you are tuning in live with me right now or you are watching this recording later, thank you for being here. Alrighty, well, I'm going to switch my camera around. I just wanted to, before I do, wave and say hi. And that will involve me stopping my video. And I also have to turn off my background because otherwise when, it's really pretty funny. If I try to show my page, it's just like my hands and then a mountain, and it just is a very entertaining attempt at things that aren't working very well. So I'll just very, very briefly go over the materials that I'm using. I can certainly answer many more questions about materials, especially during the Q&A section, but I want to keep this portion relatively simple. So for my watercolors, I'm using a palette made by Art Toolkit. And this is a really wonderful little travel palette. The little pans are refillable and you can pull them out because they're magnetic. This is what I carry when I'm backpacking, hiking, for doing any of my field painting. And I've been using variants of this palette for about the last 10 years. So it's definitely been just probably my favorite tool in my painting toolkit. And I will send you guys in the follow-up email along with the recording. You'll get a little discount code because this is really awesome, locally owned family company up here in Washington. And I just love spreading the word and supporting that. Plus I'm using for my paint palette, and I do refill these using Daniel Smith watercolors. Again, I can talk more about that later, but I just really love those paints. I've been using them for years. They're comparable to other artist grade paints. For a paintbrush, I'm going to do pretty much everything, I think, with this number 10 round paintbrush. This is the one that I have been using for a long time. These wear out a little bit more quickly for me just because I'm pretty hard on my paintbrushes. So I replace them every 2 to 6 months, depending on how much I'm painting. And then occasionally, probably not for this class, but I do have a smaller brush on hand if I really want to delve into details, but I do try whenever I can to work with the bigger paintbrush. I have a waterproof pen just in case I want to add notes or if I want to put some ink lines down first. That's always kind of fun and helpful. A pencil. I have a little paper towel here that I can wipe my paintbrush and kind of dry it off on. This is one of those just lovely shop towels you can buy at Home Depot or other hardware stores, and they last forever because you can rinse them and reuse them. So I have not bought a roll for years. And I also, once I switched to these, greatly reduced the amount of waste from my studio and my trips, because instead of using like a bunch of toilet paper or normal paper towels, I just rinse and dry these out. And then I just love them. They have been a really wonderful addition to my kit. And then for an eraser, I do have a little kneaded squishy eraser. I prefer to use the normal plastic erasers, but these do make little eraser shavings that are a total pain to deal with when I'm in the field. For years, I would just kind of scuff all the little eraser shavings into my bag and carry them home. And that just made an entertaining amount of cleaning time. So I now have a little squishy eraser. And then I always get asked in every workshop, so I'll just answer it now. How do I carry my paintings when I'm in the field? And this is how. I just use a really simple setup. It's a Tyvek sleeve. And inside of that is a piece of Coroplast or Gator board. I got like a nice fancy clear piece from a plastic supplier in Seattle, but you can just use like an old political sign. That's the same material that this is made out of. It's super durable and robust. And then when I'm traveling, I just have like my paper in here and I can just pop all the paintings in there. And because this is a Tyvek envelope, so Tyvek is a really awesome material. It's breathable, but waterproof. So even like a really heavy rain, my paintings stay dry in here, and I still will put them under the pack cover, but I one time forgot to, inadvertently got to test this out. And this is also a really nice stiff surface. So this is also what I paint on when I'm working in the field. So this can fit, really easily 5x7 paintings. I can have 2 of them on there if I want. And this will fit, it's pretty much the size of an 11x14 inch piece of paper. So I can show you what that would look like. So this is an 11x14 inch painting. You can see it pretty much fills the entire kind of edges of that little piece of board that I have. And this is what I work on. I'll occasionally tape it to the board if it's windy, or if I'm filming a lesson for my Adventure Art Academy students. That was actually what this lesson was for my student group. And it was definitely windy, so I had to tape it down, and it still kind of flapped around a little bit, which is always entertaining for me, and occasionally a good laughing moment for my students when things try to escape down the side of a mountain. But there's the little thing that I use. And I don't bring a stool or a chair. I just bring a really nice little piece of foam that I sit on as a sit pad, as I am fortunate enough that my body will allow me to sit cross-legged for a fair bit of time when I'm in the field working. Okay, that's a materials whirlwind. Again, you're welcome to drop questions in the chat, and if it's really relevant to where we are in our workshop, then I'll answer it. And if it makes more sense to save to the end, I'll just ask you to pop it back in the chat at the end, but don't be afraid to ask questions as we go along. That's one of my favorite things about doing live workshops, and why I'm offering this one live, because I just have so much fun when I can answer your questions and just see people and be here and sharing this space with everyone. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to make sure everything is in your view here. And I'm just going to start out with my lovely number 10 round brush. And again, just use whatever you have on hand, right? Especially for a workshop like this, where we're just kind of exploring a bunch of different techniques. And experimenting with whatever you have is a really, really great way to just enjoy trying your materials and getting to know them in the context of some of my favorite techniques. And Therese asked, do I ever paint from a picture taken in the field? Absolutely, Therese. I would say, from about November to, let's say, I don't know, like late April to May, almost all the paintings I do are from photographs. Like these 2 paintings are from photographs from the Olympics last summer. Like I'm definitely not. I like painting in the snow, but I personally get too cold, and the paintings do too. And painting with a frozen page is just really hard to deal with. So I do a vast majority of my winter time is from photographs. So I wanted to give us a chance just to kind of get warmed up, because I think it's possible that there might be some folks in here who have never possibly worked with watercolor very much. So I'm just going to kind of get some water on the paintbrush, stick it into the little pan. I'm choosing a nice dark blue color. And since my paints are dry, I'm kind of agitating that pan a little bit just to kind of get the paint to adhere to my paintbrush. I can swirl it around the palette just to kind of see what color and how concentrated that color is. I'm going to come back over here onto my page, and I'm just going to try making some simple marks on this page. I'm going to try making some straight-ish lines, some that are angled, some that are more horizontal. I'm going to try making some curved lines. I'm going to see what happens if I change the pressure of my paintbrush, like some brush strokes that have a minimal amount of pressure. How small of a little line can I get? I'm going to try some where I have a lot of pressure on that paintbrush, and I can see how bold of a line I can get across that page. So just take a few minutes just to play with your paintbrush. If you get tired of making little marks, then you can make some longer ones. You can also start making some curved marks across the paper. One of my favorite little kind of warm-up techniques to do is just to kind of make a curved line and be increasing and decreasing the pressure of that line as I go across the page, and just seeing how that impacts the shapes that my brush makes across the page. So go ahead and keep playing with that. There was a question about how do I clean the paintbrushes between color. So when I'm in the field, I just have this little guy. I fill it with water, and I just kind of, squish the brush around in there, wipe off the extra paint and water on my paper towel. I try to carry out as much of the paint as possible on the paper towel, so my water never ends up very dirty. So I'm never dumping a bunch of pigment in the field, just because that way I can make sure I'm not leaving any pigment behind where it maybe shouldn't be left behind. And watercolors aren't as much of a big deal as acrylics or something, but I still try to be really mindful of that. Yep, so just a little bit of water in a tin. I use a lot less water than some artists do. Like in the studio, I have a full cup, which is blatantly luxurious. I in the field just had this little guy, and like I can't fill it all the way because the water runs out in the little holes in the lid. But honestly, it works really well because it just helps me become a more efficient painter, right? If I that way I'm doing kind of all of one color if I can, and I'm not using as much paint as and not wasting as much paint. Okay. So there's some of my little technique, kind of just a little warm up with my paintbrush and doing some fun lines. The next one I want us to try is we're going to make a couple different kind of shapes across the page and play with kind of what happens when we start softening and changing edges. So go ahead and make kind of a nice little rectangular shape on the page. And so, you know, if folks who have painted with me before, I call these little color swatches. You can do one for one shade of blue, and we can do another one for a different shade of blue. If you like, if you are brand new to watercolor, just doing this with all the colors that you have is a really, really wonderful activity, because you can just kind of get an idea of, you know, what do your colors look like at a really high concentration where you're using and getting as much pigment as possible on that paintbrush, like this line I just made, or the one up above it, I had less pigment on the paintbrush, and what changes between one or the other. Because watercolor, as the name implies, we're combining water with color. And when we do that, we're able to change the kind of saturation and appearance of our watercolors in some really incredible ways. What I mean by that is if we make a really nice dark color swatch across the page, I'm going to make kind of a nice little big rectangle here. And you can choose whatever color you want for all this. I'm doing blues because I like them. I'm going to dip that paintbrush in the water, and I'm going to rinse it off a little bit, but not fully. Squeegee off some of the water, leave some on, and just run that paintbrush underneath that color swatch and draw that color down the page. After I go a little ways down, I'm going to rinse that paintbrush off some more, squeegee off most of the extra water, and run that paintbrush down once again farther on the page. And if I really want to, I can even do it one more time, rinsing all the pigment out of the brush, and then pulling this paint until there's almost no pigment left at the bottom. And what I love about this exercise right here is that we get to see kind of the full range of possibility, right? For this color that I did right here, and I can put the most dark concentration right at the top. This is called Indian Throne Blue. It's one of my favorites. It's made by Daniel Smith. It's a single pigment color. So sometimes palettes will come with paints that have more than one pigment combined to make the color that you see. And if that's the case, our paints can tend to get a bit muddier in mixtures if we aren't aware of what colors are already combined together. So I gravitate toward trying to find most of my colors are just a single pigment in each of the little pans, with a couple exceptions. And this little diagram here is called a drawdown, is what some people will call it. Others call it like a faded kind of gradient or something like that. But what I like to highlight about it is that up here on this shape, we have really hard edges. And if you'd like to label that, you're welcome to. So hard edges just implies that there's a high level of contrast between this dark area and the white area next to it. It's a super defined kind of intersection between paint and no paint. Where over here in this nice kind of soft transition from our darker paint to our lighter paint, this is what's known as a soft edge. And personally, as a painter, I really love playing with soft edges. Obviously, I have hard edges too, but soft edges are just, they have such a limitless potential for me to create wonderful mountain techniques and impressions. And they're also a fantastic shortcut for creating that sense of depth and atmosphere in a painting, especially when we're working with mountains. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up just kind of a little bit lighter blue than what I had before, adding a different shade just for fun. Then I'm adding some more water to lighten up that paint. Because if we think about, here's our little kind of possibilities for our paint. If I have more paint and less water, I get a darker color. If I have more water and less paint, I get a lighter one. So I want to start with kind of a bit of a lighter color for this first little distant ridgeline. And if you want to draw it in pencil first, you can kind of draw, here's a distant ridgeline, and we'll kind of maybe have it have a little shape, something like that. And maybe and if it dries well enough for us, then we can come back in here and we can add in a secondary ridgeline in front of that one. But for this background one, I'm just going to start by loading up this paintbrush with quite a bit of paint. Like, it's not quite dripping off there, but the bristles are definitely expanded outward. So I have enough paint on there that I can kind of go all the way along this whole background part, or this whole upper part of this ridgeline in kind of one fell swoop of the paintbrush. I can kind of pull it down a little bit. Then really quickly, before anything dries, I'm just going to dip the brush, not rinse it, And I'm just going to kind of run that paintbrush right along the bottom, just like I did before. Dip the paintbrush again, pull that paint right on down. And I can kind of do a little bit of movement side to side. I'm trying not to, squish the brush around the space too much, because ideally I'll get some interesting patterns to happen. If I get a really hard kind of junction between like a lighter area and a darker area, then don't worry, just grab some more paint, go right along the top. Especially with the paper I'm working on, this is a non-cotton paper. So this is a paper that is going to dry more rapidly because it's made from tree fibers instead of cotton fibers. So now I can see I have a pretty consistent but slight gradient of color. And if I want to accentuate that gradient to make it feel like this is kind of hazy or atmospheric down here, I can just put a little bit more paint right along the top if I want to. Depending on your paper and how dry your painting is, this will either drop in really nicely. I'll change my light angle here so you can get a little bit less of the glare on there. So mine blended in pretty well. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Again, if I work on a cotton paper, then I have a lot more control over the dry time of my pigments. It just gives me a lot more flexibility with kind of these more subtle gradient and atmospheric effects like this. And what we're doing here by having the top of the mountain be kind of this a little bit darker and the bottom a little bit lighter, and then having this will eventually be lighter than the ridgeline in front of it, we're creating atmospheric perspective. And that's what happens when you look off into the distance of a scene. We've all seen this in the beautiful mountains of Washington, where as you go into the distance, the mountains get less saturated in color, and they also get this really beautiful kind of, each layer is lighter and lighter going back toward the horizon. And one of my favorite things about watercolor is the ability to create these really unique patterns called blooms. So I'm just going to make a little kind of rectangle over here. And watercolor blooms are something that many artists actually, they'll kind of consider it a mistake, but I've come to find that it's a really, really wonderful shortcut. So this little thing over here is still too wet to really add any new water to get blooms. But this up here, I'm looking at it, and this paint is just a little bit less shiny than it was. It's kind of a matte finish instead of a, like, not quite a matte, it's like a matte slash shiny. And when my paint and my paper are at this stage, I can drop in clean water, and you can see, I'll zoom in a little bit for everyone. Here we go. You can see that what's happening is that clean water is being pulled through capillary action up into the upper part of the painting. And the result are these amazing, wonderful, fantastic patterns called watercolor blooms. And that one, I'm just gonna let it do its thing, see what happens. It'll be really fun to watch and just enjoy how those patterns manifest and change. And I'll get sometimes really pronounced patterns, and other times I'll get much more subtle patterns, depending on basically how much of a difference in drying there is between the base and then the new water. If I have a big difference between the new water and then the base, I'll get really distinct patterns. If they're more kind of closer together and how wet they are, those patterns will be more subtle. And as you can see, I don't have much control over this process. It has a mind of its own, and that's okay. My goal with a lot of my painting, especially when I'm teaching, is that I want us to be having fun and experimenting and just enjoying working with a really wonderful medium that doesn't always go the way we want it to. And that's totally fine. Like, this could be a tree, maybe in the distance, or some kind of organic pattern. And one of the ways that I can test to see if an area of paint is kind of ready to create blooming patterns is I can just tap the little end of my pinky finger into a space. And I think you can just see it, that when I tap my pinky into this nice dark splotch of pigment, it left behind just like a little teeny tiny fingerprint, where earlier, if I had tapped it, my fingerprint would have filled in. Like over here where all this water is happening, see how my fingerprint just fills in? If I were to put more water there, it wouldn't really change much, right? It's just going to make, it's just going to be absorbed into that space. But down here, if I put water in there, that water will be pulled out into the surrounding area. And this is so dark, you can't really see what's happening, but we will get to watch it and see how things progress. And up here, I don't really have much control, again, over this lovely, wonderful blobby shape that is happening. And that occurred because as my paper kind of dries, the water puddled right here in kind of a dip in the paper. And if I want to, I can kind of run my paintbrush across a paper towel, and I can lift out a little bit of the extra moisture if I want to prevent further crazy patterning happening. But I just try to embrace it and just figure it looks like interesting organic patterns or a crazy cloud. And if you really want to, you can kind of try to move some of the paint along an edge like this, but you can see that no paintbrush mark can really imitate and mimic just the really amazing patterns created by blooms. So they're definitely a technique that requires a little bit of surrendering to the wonderful, the wonderful mind of our watercolor, which is one of the reasons why I love it in the field. So any questions about that kind of technique of using blooms? And I could have left that the way I had it originally, with that really subtle, gentle gradient if I wanted that more delicate atmospheric effect, right, instead of this more defined kind of patterned effect here. Just let me know if you have any questions in there. And while that's drying, I can show you an example of a painting where the blooms turned out really differently than normal. I'm gonna make sure all the paint is wiped off of my hands before I handle a painting. My poor field paintings get a lot of excitement in the field, and once they get home, I try to be a little bit more gentle with them. So this was a painting made when I was sitting at camp near the Easton Glacier in the North Cascades, and it was really, really kind of much more humid than even my indoor environment here, because as I was painting, these beautiful clouds started to kind of drop down onto our camp. So as a result of that, you can see that I got these really much more subdued and kind of delicate blooming patterns up here and down here. And that was just because my page stayed so damp that there wasn't a really dry area for that pigment to run into and then stop moving. And I love doing pages like this. This is a combination of a sketch plus some handwritten notes and some little kind of sketches down here. And, we can use either paint or sketches to convey the same idea I was mentioning of that atmospheric perspective, right? Where the things that are farther away are going to have less detail and they're less dark than the things that are closer to us. So that's kind of one of the big things that I think about a lot when I'm working with mountains, is that I'm always trying to keep in mind this kind of structure of lighter in the background and to darker in the foreground. And although there are occasions where this pattern doesn't always hold, I will often exaggerate or just put this pattern in, even if I don't see it entirely, just so that way my painting feels like it does have things closer to us and things farther away, or like it feels like it has the impression of depth. So that's one of kind of my shortcuts, and the big things that I do is all kind of force depth sometimes, even if it isn't there necessarily. Okay. This is still wet, so we can't do any painting on that. Questions? Oh, Kim asked, do I use a ruler to make the pen lines to frame the painting? No, I do not. If I'm doing a bigger one like that, then I'll just, usually in my little kind of, little sleeve of paper I showed you, I'll have one piece of paper that has a straight edge, and I'll just use that to trace the shape. If, however, I'm working with smaller little shapes that I'm making, I'll just use the edge of my palette. And if, I save me from having to save a ruler, so I don't have that extra little thing to lose, because most of the small rulers are clear. So I'm always afraid I'm gonna leave it behind. So the edge of my palette or the edge of a piece of paper work just perfect for me. And I'm also I really like to have as few materials as possible. Even going to a palette that had this wider array of colors was really exciting and fun for me, and took a lot of kind of thought to figure out what I actually wanted in that kit. But I really don't carry that much. If I'm out in the field, this is kind of, the paintbrush, paper, eraser, the pen. This is kind of the basic kit I carry, and that might be it, plus the little tin for water and a paper towel. So I may not be ultralight in my other equipment, because I like to have an extra puffy jacket to carry around to keep myself warm when I'm sitting down painting. So I definitely get more cold than my friends who are up and rambling around a bit more. So that's almost dry, but at this point, if I were to put wet paint right in here, and I can just show you what would happen. If I were to try to put a little bit of paint right here, you can see that paint would just be pulled up into that area, and I would lose the hard defined edge that I want. So I can just lift that paint out. Using a clean paintbrush that's just a little bit damp, I can just lift that right out, and it will, for the most part, come with me. So while that's kind of doing its thing up there, I want to share a little bit about kind of ways that we can think about mountains to help us paint them a little bit more realistically, or with just like a little bit more kind of acuity, and just to have an easier time of visualizing them. And that is that one of the kind of concepts that I repeat to myself a lot and to my students is this idea that when we're looking at mountains, we're already going to have kind of this idealized form in mind. Because oftentimes, if I'm in a live group setting, I'll have everyone close their eyes, and I have everybody kind of imagine, an early memory of what they were told a mountain looked like. And across the board, as people kind of call out their descriptions of what that mountain looks like, It is a triangle, sometimes with a little sub triangle on the side. That triangle will have a little snow skirt partway down. And then very often there's a couple foothills at the bottom of that mountain as well. And for almost all of us who've done a Western education, this is what we're told a mountain looks like. And the problem is that most mountains don't look like that. They look like a marshmallow that gets squished down into a paper. So we kind of have to let go of this concept that we already have on our head. And the phrase that I repeat to myself to help me recall that message is that I want to stop naming and start seeing. So that's one of my favorite things to remind myself and my students. And I am very bad at speaking and writing. So we'll just do the writing for the time being. So stop naming and start seeing. And that's, especially when we're thinking about trying to simplify and how to make a complicated landscape more easily accessible for us to see the patterns and be able to notice all the different shapes. I want to see what's actually there, not what I think should be there, if that makes sense to folks. And along those same lines, there's a little trick that I landed on a little while ago, and that is to try to think of, yes, I can think of the mountain. I want to let go of the triangle with the perfect little snow skirt, but I do want to look for ways that I can make my mountain look three-dimensional. And one of the biggest ways that we can do that is that even though our mountain might kind of have this silhouette, our squished mountain silhouette, that's still roughly a cone in some ways, right? And if we want to make a cone look three-dimensional, then the way to do that is that we don't sit here and make a bunch of vertical lines all going the same direction. And we also don't do a bunch of horizontal lines, because those just look like, I don't look like, cheese graters or something. So instead, to make a mountain shape look three-dimensional, a bunch of our lines will or cones and mountains too, will kind of radiate from the summit outward. And even though I'm not painting, this perfect shape over here, I still want to, kind of keep in mind that overall, the shapes that I'm painting, especially when I'm looking for them in my landscape, they will kind of radiate out from that summit in general out toward the bottom of the mountain. Because that will really help this kind of have that sense of three-dimensionality. Because again, if we're imagining that we're standing here as the little viewer, this part of the mountain right here is going to be the closest to us, because it's overall, if you look at it on a topographic map, most mountains will kind of expand outward from a central point. And some follow different patterns and whatnot, but in general, they follow that. So I like to kind of think about looking for cones, basically, in my landscape. And what that can look like is that sometimes I will have a really nice, simple mountain where I have, okay, here's my lovely summit. And then, what happens when here's a sub-ridge line? Because now if I go to overlay my lovely cones on this, I'm gonna grab a couple different colors of pens here. Up here, when I'm looking at this mountain straight on, I'm going to have, these nice radiating lines, because I'll have kind of rock shapes here and here. But then on this shape right here, we're actually no longer looking at a mountain straight on. And all I'm seeing of that cone is kind of just one portion of it. I'm kind of seeing like this portion of it. So on this section right here, and we can imagine we have a bunch of little cones kind of on this zone right here. On this face here, most of our lines will actually kind of go like this. They'll angle in a consistent downward direction toward the right. Again, that happens because we're only seeing part of these cone shapes. We're looking at it kind of off to the side. Does that make sense to folks? Any questions? Drop them in the chat. It's interesting as painters and artists when we're looking at these landscapes, because we have to be both letting go of the idealized things we have stuck in our head, but then also trying to simplify. So we're still looking for those most basic shapes. And that's where, looking at our landscape and looking for these patterns can be very helpful, because, for example, in this painting, these shapes that I painted are all roughly, on this little guy up here, they're roughly radiating from that summit. And this one over here, kind of the same thing. And then over here, this one was kind of looking at the side of this ridge line. So my lines go off toward the left and almost no go off toward the right. And I like to share that because I've been told many times from current students that it's one of the more helpful ways of thinking about mountains. And obviously, sometimes you just get mountains that are so far away or so jumbled that those rules fall apart. Like this one, really only where that rule kind of helps was like this little shape right here. But in this background, the mountain was just so snowy and so far away that I just look for the shapes instead. So why don't we go ahead and we can put our next ridge line in, and then we can put that kind of mental framework into practice. So now I'm going to grab a much darker color, as I mentioned before. Doing the same thing where I'll grab a bunch of paint on that paintbrush, go back to the paint if I need to, and then just kind of make this whole shape be filled in all at once. I'll grab some cleanish water and just fade that nice whole ridgeline kind of downwards until we have kind of the same thing of like a very simple gradient from darker down to lighter. And there we go. And if I angle the paper, and the nice thing is that while this is still wet, we can totally change the shape of this whole ridgeline. Like I can put a big bump there. I can make that steeper or shallower or more kind of jaggedy or less jaggedy. But as soon as this starts to dry, then I can no longer put any more input in here without leaving kind of weird streaks and patterns behind. And my beautiful blooms kind of made the impression of their own little like clouds. In this one, they kind of look like, sometimes they'll look like rocky patterns, sometimes like clouds. But just even with this simple exercise, we can kind of see how, or so hopefully see and experience how this ridgeline here feels closer to us and that one behind us feels a little bit farther away. Okay, I'm gonna put this page aside and grab another one. And we can kind of put into practice some of those little ways of thinking about rocky patterns and shapes when we're working with watercolor. Any questions from folks? Again, don't be shy. There's no such thing as a stupid question. And you're also always welcome to direct your questions to me and only me if you just change who it's going to in a little to box. And then if I see one that comes to me, I usually don't mention the name along with it. I'm going to pull my light a little bit farther forward so I can try to get a little bit more even light on the page. There we go. Since the sun is now very much so gone. And Amber asked, in general, do I need to wait for each layer to dry before going on to the next one? Amber, yes, if I want to do this kind of technique right here. The only way around that is to be kind of mindful and careful of my layering, like you see here. And if I leave a little teeny tiny white border between these layers, then wherever I have the white border, I can work on these two areas as they're wet. In any place where I lost the white border, if I zoom in, you can see right here, see how the paint kind of bled into that wet zone. So in this painting, it works like over here, I lost the white border completely. So I lost that really defined hard edge. But that was definitely the little trick that I used for a lot of this painting, because like I said, it got so damp that this painting didn't dry until I pulled it into the vestibule of my tent and let it sit there, like until after I went to bed. So yes, either let it dry in between layers if you want them to overlap. Like if I wanted that pink underneath the blue, I had to have the kind of gentle pink of the mountain dry. And then over here, I was getting cold and very done. So I just left a little white line, and that allowed me to paint two areas concurrently. I call it like a white line painting. It's a technique that's used sometimes in printmaking, actually. I kind of stumbled on it when I was having to paint in really humid conditions during a residency a number of years ago. And it's become a staple in how I work on a painting. And I got a question about how long does it take to make each painting? Oh man, I like to respond that like 10 years. I know, meaning that, you know, I've been practicing painting for 10 years, right? So my ability to create, you know, a painting, like where's a good example? Like this one here was a little sketch done up at Artist Point, you know, and for me as someone who's practiced a lot in these situations, I think this was like maybe a 30-minute painting or something like that. And I'm honest about, you know, doing how long things take me. But it's taken 10 years of practice to be able to paint this in that little amount of time. So most of my students, they'll either double or triple or even quadruple the time for some things, or they'll just hit pause in my lessons if I go too fast. Because when I'm filming those classes out in the field, I kind of have to work at a faster pace sometimes. So that's the wonderful thing about, you know, having pre-recorded classes, or you guys watching this lesson again, is that you can hit pause if I get ahead of you. But and the time completely depends on the complexity too. Like this one, you know, didn't take as long as a landscape I'm very comfortable with. When I was working on this scene, let me find it from Mount Rainier. This one was something that I don't paint as often, a reflection. So that took me much longer. You know, I was on site here for a number of hours, and especially because I was filming this for my students as well. So that always adds in a lot of extra time because I'm also, you know, explaining what I'm doing in each step of the way. So I'm not able to work quite as quickly, which is fun for me as I get to kind of make an external, you know, very internal conversation and share that outwardly. Kim asked, do I use masking fluid for the white line? I do not personally, Kim, because it would slow me down too much in the field. And in the studio, I'm just comfortable leaving those white spaces, so I don't bother. but some folks do. But I feel like for me, it would kind of defeat, for me, the personal purpose of the white lines is so I can work really quickly. And if we have time, I'll show a little demo of how that can work for folks. So I just wanted to do a little kind of sample here, and you guys can follow with me. I was just showing kind of the idea of, radiating lines versus, and how to paint rock patterns, basically. So let's say I'm going to have a kind of nice little shape right here, which is a lovely little kind of ridge line. And if I want there to be snow and rock here, it's not going to look very three-dimensional. If I just have all of my snow and rock patterns going all vertical, because that almost never happens in mountains. It will only happen on a select few that are incredibly, incredibly steep. So if all I do here is just having vertical shapes, then it's not going to look too much like a three-dimensional mountain. It'll start looking very, very flat. The same thing holds if I were to do a similar shape like this, and if I were to have all of my lines be horizontal. Once again, my mountain would not have very much depth or sense of three-dimensionality to it, because all the shapes I'm painting are going in the same direction. Instead, like I mentioned before, if I want to have that sense of three-dimensionality, especially when rocks are involved, because rocks are such a wonderful and challenging thing to paint, like rocks and snowfield are some of my absolute favorite topics to explore. I'm going to kind of imagine and say, okay, here's like kind of one rough cone I'm looking for. And when I'm looking for those cones and those patterns, obviously I'm relying the most on my actual landscape, right? I'm looking at the landscape and using that as a framework to help me see more accurately. I'm not using that as just like the only way I approach a landscape. I use it as a tool to help me understand and see. So instead, if I kind of look, I say, okay, here's a kind of a nice chunk, and here's another little chunk of rock. And you'll notice that as I'm painting these rocks, I'm intentionally leaving little kind of white areas in them, because I can always cover over a white area, but I can never get them back. And I really love leaving little white areas in my kind of snowfield, like in my rocks, or even my snowfield, like, little tiny areas here and there, because I feel like it just kind of helps bring to life the idea that, those little white sections can either be rock, or they could be snow, or they could just kind of be a textural area. So I'm not afraid to leave white, even if that's actually a dark rock there. Then over here, I'm gonna do the same thing. So here's kind of some nice dark rock, and here is the top, and then here's some more kind of lines coming down. And there's my overall kind of rocky shapes. And when I'm working on those rock, like right down here on the side, I actually don't want that little, I don't want that white spot there, so I can just get rid of it. But as long as I like to have the option. And now you can see it feels like we have a three-dimensional shape. If we were to kind of break down this, shape using that framework, then here's the little two kind of peaks. This one kind of has these rough radiating lines like that. And over here on this one, we're really only seeing a couple lines like that. And so I love doing leaving kind of extra white spots to imply texture and pattern. And if I were to break down with a little bit more simplicity, kind of the shapes or the brush strokes and shapes I'm making for my rocks, very often, especially in our Northwest mountains, our rocks will kind of be a combination of like a blob. They might be a blob like that. They might have a really hard defined edge along the ridgeline. And then maybe they have a hard defined edge down here. And then, I can leave like some little kind of white areas inside if I want, or I can fill them in. And learning to paint rocks just takes a lot of practice and just, hopping on and working on it. But I found that when I work with my students, and I've been working with some of them for 2 years now, when we start really looking for the direction that the rocks are moving across a landscape, that's when they start to look a lot more realistic, because the natural tendency for most new folks when they paint rocks is to go here, right? They paint everything vertical or horizontal, or the two of them together. So very often when I'm working with new folks, it's, we spend a lot of time here. And I have a couple of lessons where like most of the lesson is spending time just practicing rocks. And like early in the pandemic, I worked for a really long time with a private lesson student. We spent many hours together online, and we just painted mountains and shapes. And we'd started with like Kilimanjaro with its picture perfect radiating lines. And then we worked our way up to things in the North Cascades and the Olympics that have just like the most wonderfully wonky shapes. Because sometimes they cooperate really beautifully, and other times I'm like, is that really the direction the rocks are going? But yeah, it is. So any questions about that kind of little demo and comparison? And if you have questions, put them in there. I will answer them after putting some shadows down, because I know that a couple of folks had questions about shadows, and I love painting shadows. So while they're drying, I'll answer your questions. So I'm going to just do a very similar shape actually to the one that I just did. Might as well stick with what we've been working with already. So there's kind of our main ridgeline. Here's a secondary ridgeline. And so there's kind of our rough, maybe we'll make it a little less picture perfect, right? So here's some kind of other stuff happening in there. And maybe I want to say, okay, you know, here's going to be a big thing of rock that kind of goes down this whole side. Here's kind of a little, maybe a sub ridgeline that comes across. Here's going to be some more rock in here. And let's just, for sake of this little demo, let's just say that our sun is kind of coming this direction, kind of from behind this peak. So that will give us some really lovely defined shadows coming into these spaces here off of this ridge and off of this ridge and off of this one. So I'm going to put those shadows in and then drop those questions in. So we'll want to kill a couple minutes while our shadows dry. So for shadows, one of my absolute favorite colors to use is a combination of two pigments, actually. It's going to be phthalo blue green shade. That's this like show-stopping party color. I'll make a note about phthalo blue green shade, and in any of the phthalo colors, especially like phthalo green, phthalo blue, blah, blah, blah. I imagine these are kind of the colors, like if you went to a party, they're the ones who it's like 2 a.m. the bar is closing down and they're just like still dancing on the tables because they just love to steal the show, and they're so pigmented and very, very staining, which means that these pigments like to sit in the paper, and once they're in, they don't like to come back out. So I often will combine my phthalo colors with some other pigment like Indian Throne Blue, because these two work really nice together, because Indian Throne Blue is a lovely, dark, gorgeous, luscious pigment. But when it dries 30 to 50% less saturated than it appears when I first put it down. So this lovely, vibrant blue that I made right here will not look that vibrant when I actually finish the painting. So by adding this party color, I can encourage my blue to stay more vibrant while still having that element of darkness to it. So again, for this landscape, I'm gonna say, okay, there's gonna be a shadow coming off of here. And I put some paint down and decided that was too dark. So I just kind of rinse the brush, wipe off some of the extra water, and I can kind of move that paint across. I'm also deciding that's a bit too heavy on the phthalo blue. So I'll just kind of grab some more of the Indian Throne Blue, mix it in, and then just kind of proceed onto the page. And I want shadows to be usually about 50% lighter in general. And I break that rule sometimes depending on the landscape, but in general, they're about 50% lighter than what the rocks will be. That doesn't always hold, but I just, use that rough number because it helps folks kind of be able to visualize what they're actually, that there does have to be a difference in the darkness of the pigments in order for this to work. So the dark rocks can show up on top. And I'm just gathering pigment from my page. That works just fine. Like, so here's going to be some more shadow over here. And I'm trying not to use too much paint here because I really do want to be able to put my rocks over the top without having to wait too long. I'm going to lighten up that shadow color even a little bit more as I go back to this kind of distant ridge line. And I'll kind of say, okay, there goes my shadow. And whenever I'm able to, I like to paint my shadows on first. It gives me the most control over how the edges will appear in my final painting. Because if I don't do the shadows first, then it's a little bit harder sometimes to be able to have the really crisp edges that I love and have become kind of a staple in many of my paintings. So there's my kind of shadows. And because I wasn't looking at a reference image, like I have some repetition of shapes, like, from here to there. So I might come in here and just try to kind of make that look a little bit different than the friend over there, just for fun. It's always interesting when I work without a reference image, because you can see here and here and here, right, that my brain was defaulting again to just kind of the same things. Our brains are really good at enforcing patterns. So I'm gonna let it dry. I can answer some of your questions. So someone asked, would I recommend using multiple colors for one mountain or just different shades? I think it just depends on what you're going for in a painting. I'm a big fan of using a very, as limited of a palette as I can, with the exception of blues. I usually throw in a couple extra blues just because I love them so much. And I feel like I can change the character of a painting a lot. So I mean, my limited palette, and this is a perfect time to show, I just made this. So for this painting here, I'm gonna zoom back out a little bit. So, and I do a lot of monochromatic paintings. I will say that's how I actually learned and I taught myself how to paint mountains, especially was doing monochromatic painting. So doing a scene like this with just a single dark pigment like a gray or a blue. That was an incredible exercise. And then I slowly started kind of working my way up. But for this painting, so over here are the base pigments I used. I had 2 different yellows, like 1 pink, 1 kind of brownish reddish color, and then 3 blues. So basically I just have, variations on the different primaries. What I love about doing that is that when I'm working with just variations of the different primary colors, it brings a lot of harmony into the painting. You can see that when I put these, kind of expand the painting outward onto a color wheel. And I actually did this recently for a YouTube video where I was walking through my color choices and the mixes I made for this. So that's a free resource that's online already. Because I had a lot of questions come in from folks on a recent video about how do you kind of choose your colors. And so even though, and in some paintings, I'll limit it even further. I'll have just 1 yellow, 1 red, and like 1 or 2 blues. But when I'm working in the field, I often am not afraid to add, a couple different versions of each primary color, especially because I'm pretty comfortable and confident in my ability to mix colors, and that will always feel harmonious. And by not like using a canned green, like a green that came out of a tube, these greens are made using all the base colors. So that really, again, kind of brings a sense of unity to the colors. And yeah, I mean, and I could go on forever about colors, but I hope that helps. Yeah, so this one had those colors, and then I have another example. Let's see, I think this painting is much more limited. I think this little guy was just 2 blues, a dark blue, a lighter blue, and a green, and maybe a little bit of gray. Actually, no, it was a yellow, not a green. Yes, we had 2 blues, a yellow, and a gray. So we only had 4 colors in this one. So a much more limited palette for that scene. And I loved, and then this color gray back here was, I think, just my neutral tint, kind of nice gray from my palette. Okay, this is almost dry and ready for us to add our rocks to it. Is there one more question someone has before I put some rocky texture in there? Okay. Awesome. I'm going to start putting some rocks on. So I'm going to use that beautiful shortcut color, that neutral tint that I mentioned. Neutral tint is a color that is made by Daniel Smith. It's one of the few mixes I have in my palette. It's a combination of a blue, a black, and I think also a purple, if I recall correctly. I think it has this purple down here in it. And I love this color. I think it was actually the first tube of watercolor I ever bought. And it's the color that I use for all of my black and white monochromatic paintings. The reason I love this single pigment is because of the different pigments in it. It has really tiny particle sizes. So I can get really, really stunning blooms really, really easily. Because some paints, like our lovely, like In Contrast, a paint that I don't use a ton, but I still have in my palette, is this one, which is called Lunar Black. And this one has much bigger particles in that paint, and it likes to make a sandy texture. And I won't go into this too much, but basically this kind of paint that I just showed is called a granulating pigment, and my lovely neutral tint color is a non-granulating pigment. And with the kind of techniques that I like to do, being able to put the blooms in is much easier in a pigment that doesn't like to behave like sand in a little box that you shake with water. And these pigments are amazing, but they're just a bit harder for students to control and just general artists to control. So oftentimes when I have folks come to my classes and they're really struggling with their paintings, they may not have known about this difference in how pigments behave. And then once we go through their palette and they figure out which ones do this and which ones do this, then all of a sudden painting gets a lot easier because we can actually just anticipate better how our pigments will behave on a page. So once my shadows are done, I'm going to have, some of my rocks are going to have a little bit more of a bluish cast to them. So I'm going to add some of that dark indanthrone blue in there. So any of the rocks that are on top of the shadowed areas, you can imagine those rocks are in the shade. So they're going to be a darker, more bluish kind of color to them. So I'm going to have there's some rocks there. Here's some more rocks right here. Just going to roll. I'm just imagining what this could look like. There's some rocks there. And then I'll say back here, here's a few little rocky chunks. Maybe there's some actual just snow fields on this one too. So not all of it has to be covered with rocks. So we'll kind of combine those two together. And then things start to get interesting when we start to leave the shadowed areas. So I'll put a few more dark rocks in here. And I can, deviate from my shadowed space as long as I'm making a nice dark shape, right? I can change the shape of this whole kind of sub ridge line if I want. I can put, another little shape down there. But then once I start to leave the shadowed zone, that's when I might add a little bit of reddish color. Like I might add this pigment called Indian red, named after the country of India where the original pigment was sourced. Because then when I add this kind of more reddish paint down into areas that's just slightly reddish, then it will help it feel like this rock might still be in the sun a little bit. This is something that I do a lot in my paintings, is just kind of work from one section to the next. And just by having these kind of more subtle color shifts, I can really bring a painting to life in a way that might be missing otherwise in a landscape. So hopefully, and that's a pretty subtle difference between the more reddish and the more bluish, but and the lights make it a little bit harder to see. But it is there, I promise. Awesome. And there we go. So we'll let that one dry. And I'll answer this question and then I can take you all off mute and you're welcome to ask questions with audio in a moment. But that concludes, and I'll get to that question momentarily, but that concludes the majority of the content that I want to share with you. Before I dive into the Q&A, and I'll stick around for a little bit of extra, I just want to say thank you all so much for being here and sharing some time with me. And that if you would like to continue learning more to paint landscapes with me, I'd love it if you wanted to check out my classes. I'll send you some more info in our follow-up email, but I just have so much fun going to different places and creating paintings and filming them on site and getting to share the joy of that experience and the techniques I use in those landscapes with students. Like this was one of the Adventure Art Academy classes from the first year back in 2021. And it was just filmed at Bagley Lakes up in the Artist Point area, kind of in the really early season when there's still a lot of snow. And I was hoping for a bluebird day. And of course I got this amazingly socked in weather and it broke just enough. And I have not been able to time it this perfectly ever since. And I was so happy because this is kind of the only class I've gotten to do so far where we really got to work with a super limited palette of like 3 colors and really play with all the atmospheric techniques of subtle, soft edges and then the trees and the reflection being super loose. So it was so much fun. And it brings me so much joy to get to work with my students. So I hope some of you might be inspired to check that out. And the classes, I try to keep them as accessible as I can. They cost $24.50 a month, and you can just tune in for however long you want. I don't open and close the doors because I want it to be fun and accessible for folks that I know have busy schedules. So some people pop in for a little while, others have been with me for a couple of years. And again, I'll send you guys more information about the palette and like a resource guide and that kind of thing in my follow-up email. But now I can do Q&A. So I'm going to answer the questions in the chat, and I will also allow you all to unmute yourselves. So I'm going to allow that now. But before you do, let me get to these questions first. So somebody asked, when do I draw an outline beforehand versus drawing without one? Almost every painting, I will have an outline of some kind, usually with pencil. Sometimes I'll do pen, but I personally, especially when I'm trying to make a representational landscape, having some kind of rough sketch will help me a lot. And that's something that I do, or that was something that I realized pretty early on as I started teaching, was that a lot of lessons, they just kind of send you the image and they say, okay, show up to the class with your sketch already done. And I find that that's really, really challenging because sketching is one of the hardest parts of a painting. So I intentionally will walk my students through in all of my classes when it's a full lesson, how I approach that sketch, everything from composition to when I'm actually sitting there, how do I approach the sketch? So that way you can, have kind of that experience alongside me of how do we actually choose what to paint and getting those guidelines down as we go along. Somebody asked, Alex asked, what brand of paper? I primarily use Arch's 140-pound cold press. So cold press paper will have a slight texture to it, like this one right here. It's kind of hard, if you go to the back, you might be able to see there's a little bit of texture back there. These are all of my notes about my colors that I used in the painting. Highly recommend that you do that because there's no way that I would have remembered at all what these pigments were if I hadn't written them on the back immediately after working on it. So I like the textured cold press paper. It's a little bit more forgiving, especially for new students or just honestly artists in general. The alternative is a cold press paper, which is much more smooth and it's a little bit harder to deal with for a variety of reasons. The paper I was demoing on right here is a really wonderful, cheap, non-archival paper, which means that it will yellow and degrade over time. It's just the big Hansen XL watercolor paper pads. And I'll send you guys a link for that too. I like this paper because even though it's super cheap, I can practice on it and I just know that it's going to dry faster and not behave as nicely or as consistently as my wonderful cotton paper, but it's a lot cheaper. And to save money, I do buy my cotton paper in the full size sheets. So they're 30 inches by 22 inches, and I just tear it or cut it down to size. And that has really helped me reduce the cost of paper. Let's see. What colors would I recommend for using for mountain, for shadows within snow? A really light gray. Oh man. I mean, if you are making a painting and you know that you like if you've already used this neutral tint, well, I have a lot of blue in my paintbrush still. If you've already used neutral tint somewhere else in your painting, this can make a really wonderful light gray. I only use neutral tint as my gray if I've actually used it elsewhere, because if I just throw this into a painting and I have mixed all of my other colors, this one will feel out of place. So if I wanted to mix a really nice gray, then the ways to get a gray is just to combine some of our, some of our three primary colors. So one of my favorites that has a slight sandy texture is going to be some ultramarine blue, a little bit of my rose pigment, which is a nice pink color. And I add in a little bit more blue. And then I can also add in a little bit of my yellowy, my more kind of orangey yellow color. That's a little bit too much. So mixing grays is just, it takes time and practice to kind of get used to how it goes. Like here I have more kind of a yellowy gray. If I add a bit more blue, then I have kind of a bluey gray. And if I put in a little teeny bit more pink, then I have like a little bit more of a neutral, teeny bit more pink. There's kind of a nice neutral gray that's very, very close to that neutral tint color that I had already showed. So whenever I possibly can, I do like to mix my own grays using the variants of the primary colors in my painting, because I just have so many more possibilities for interesting grays, right? Because oftentimes like snow will have a little bit of pink in it, which can be kind of cool. So I can get a gray that has kind of that pinkish cast to it, like if I went somewhere in there. And that's going to be a really spectacular, much more interesting and lively gray than this one on its own. So again, I only use that shortcut color if I've used it elsewhere in a painting, like up here. Hope that answered that question well for you. And in my painting, like in my lessons, Chelsea, we end up making a lot of grays in different paintings because I do it a lot. Like in that one I showed you, that was, I think, a cobalt blue atmospheric painting, a cobalt and Indian, like a cobalt blue and Indian red, and then I think neutral tint too. I just used in that one to make it easy on myself. So, but I'm also not afraid just to use my shortcut colors as well. Kim asked, do I erase parts of the original sketch as I go? It depends, Kim. Sometimes if I have a line that like I'm really not enjoying, that's really obnoxiously like standing out too much, then yes, I'll erase it. Like if I had a line that was like right up here and I didn't end up painting that, then I would erase that one. But oftentimes I'll just leave the other lines. I figure, and especially because in the field, I'm oftentimes working so fast that I just kind of forget to erase them. And it's really hard to erase lines, ones like this, once they have the pigment over them. So since I can really only erase fully the lines that don't have any paint over them, unless again, it's like a really obnoxious one, I just leave all the lines and just embrace them as part of the story of the painting. Okay, any other questions from folks? And you should have the ability to take yourself off mute if you would like. April asked, I'm not related to Maria, but we have hung out a little bit, not a ton though. So, but that's so funny. No one's commented that we've done some workshops together. So it'll be funny if Maria and I are in the same webinar. People will be confused which one of us is which.
I have a question. Is the mountain, the last mountain you did with the shading and stuff, is it dry enough to add another layer to? Like, what would you do next to that?
So for this one, like it's not quite dry yet. It's still a little bit shiny. I wonder if I can get that to appear for you guys. If I turn it. So there we go. You can see it's still shiny in this middle portion right there. So I just like, if I wanted to start painting again on this, I just wouldn't touch that one part. The rest is plenty dry enough. And in a painting like this, like my next step might be to come in here with a very nice, like a super duper light kind of grayish blue. Like just a really light version of the color I used in the rocks. Like if I wanted to kind of change, make some of the snow have a little bit more kind of texture and to it. So it wasn't such a boring, just white blobs. And whether I come back in and add this texture to the snow will depend a lot on how far away I am from my subject. Like if this is a really, really distant mountain, then I would not add in this. I would just rely on, the shapes of the rocks and the shadows to do all that work for me. If it's a closer in mountain, then I can add this in. But you can see that if I start to add this too much, and if I agitate these edges too much, like if I keep running the paintbrush over it, then I will disturb that edge and pull some of that blue paint down, and I'll lose that really hard and defined edge. So yeah, it just depends on how far away something is from me and what effect and look that I want. And also what my landscape is doing, like, is that snow dirty? Is it clean? And whether the kind of colors and patterns of the snow will tell the story of place, right? Of in what time of year is it? In early season, it may have looked like it was before I added the extra gray to the snow, because it's just, the snow is still so clean and there's not much like gray stuff on there yet. We haven't melted out to the previous layers of snow and whatnot. Like, see, like, I don't like that over there. So we can just, that's not gonna lift out, but like talking and making aimless marks doesn't always work. But yeah, basically, at that point, my next steps will be determined by the landscape itself, which hopefully has answered your question. Yeah, and Susanna, you all will be getting the recording tomorrow. So within the next 24 hours, I will send that out to you guys. And somebody asked if I ever use the water brushes, the brushes that have the water in the handle. Yes, I do. I don't use them as much as I used to because they are a little bit more unpredictable. So for those who don't know, a water brush basically has synthetic fibers on the tip, and then up here it actually has a chamber that you can fill with water. So instead of having to dip your brush into a little jar or a cup, you just squeeze the handle and water comes out in like a blob. So my tip is that when I'm working with water brushes, I never squeeze it over my paper. I just squeeze it over my palette, and I make a couple puddles of water, and those puddles end up being different colors. But then whenever I want some water, I just dip into the puddle and then go to the paint or to my page instead of squeezing it over something, because then you get a big blob that you can't do much with. I only really squeeze and get big blobs if I'm like trying to make blooms somewhere. So far I think I filmed one lesson that was entirely done with water brushes. I think it was the second, or it was the third lesson I ever made. And it's still a favorite of students. It was a much more simplified and kind of semi-abstracted landscape, similar a little bit to this one actually that I did a couple of weeks ago. Different scene and a little bit, but trees and water basically. And we used a water brush for that one. So I had some people who were welcome to, they chose what they wanted to use. Yeah, and Therese, I will be sending out my email just for students tomorrow. If you would like to send me a question now, that email is claire@adventureartacademy.com. And, I am the most available to my students who are in the Adventure Art Academy classes because I just get a ton of inquiries from folks. So my priority will go toward current students, but I do my best to get back to folks via email. And especially right now, because I'm not at any art residencies, I'm home and actually in the studio. So as a couple of my students I see on this call, they know this well by now that once it hits about June, they just have to email me twice. So I'm more than happy to follow up over email if you have other questions. Yeah, and so don't be shy to reach out.
What's the favorite painting you've done?
That's a great question. I think I have a new favorite painting every few months. My current favorite painting is too big to actually bring over to the table. It's 30 inches wide. It's of Mount Anderson. I don't know if I have a way to show it to you guys. I'll link to it in the email. It's a scene in the Olympic Mountains, and it's a different time of day to this little guy. It looks really different from this one, but it's the same mountain. This is the different time of day, but it's much more simple. And I actually ended up basing it on the field sketch I'd done. So it's my favorite thing because of the memories of it. But honestly, my favorite painting changes all the time. And sometimes I make a painting that I really dislike. Like this was a painting done at a lake up in the Alpine Lakes Wilderness. Well, the original one was. And then I got it back home and I had spent 3 hours filming this thing and I was so excited about it. And then I got it home and watched my recording and it was just a jumbled mess. So I ended up, for that lesson was a unique one, in that I, walked my students through what went wrong, when it went wrong, and then this is how I wished I had painted it, was in this much more simplified form with far, far less detail and way less confusion and chaos in the rocks over here. Because I think, every painting teaches me something. So some of them I know right away. I love them. They're my favorites. And other ones like the original version of this, which I think I already archived in a box. Some of them just don't work, and that's okay. That's all part of the wonderful learning process and the experimentation. And, they can be frustrating, but I personally know that I learn the most from the paintings that feel like the biggest failures. So I still try to put them up and put them on my wall and live with those paintings so I can try to maximize what I'm learning from them, which isn't always easy. Because some paintings I just get really tired of, but I still put them on the wall.
What's the last thing you add to a painting?
Oh, the last thing I add to a painting, it depends on the painting. Obviously, okay, a good example is like these two little buddies right here. That for these two, just because I wanted the trees to have a really defined, and they're super dark and they're really hard edged, they have to be done last, in order for because otherwise if I try to paint like rocks on top of them, then I disturb those lines and I get like fuzzy edges everywhere. But like on this painting, I actually painted the rocks, or like painted the beautiful trees in the middle. And then I painted this section down here. And then I put the teeny little wildflowers in. Those were avalanche lilies. And I thought they were just like the most charming little things. And it was so fun to get to paint them. So last thing depends on the painting. Like in this painting, the last thing was, I think, the water. In other paintings, the water will be first. Like in this painting, the water happened after the sky. Let's see, where's another example of something? Sometimes I don't even work with paint and I work with just ink, pen and ink. And this is a wonderful and super powerful practice just to do sketches in pen and ink. I think, when people ask me how to become better painters, I often will recommend that they do a just a sketching practice. And I, for 100 days last year, did a sketch every day in a notebook, everything from trees to random rocks to mountain scenes to woodland, like this is what I think this is somewhere in the San Juans, to treed scenes. And all of these I did without doing a pencil sketch. So they were direct ink to paper. Some worked out okay, some worked out really jumbly mess and I gave up on that. Some I finally learned how to sketch snowy trees, right? But it was such an incredible and wonderful challenge for me just to start sketching. And if things went sideways in terms of like my mountain got way too big on one part or the other, I had to just learn. And I started much more simply. Like I started here and I started here, and then I got better as I went along, and I got much more confident, like to try book shapes. And then I was like, I felt lazy that day and that day. And then this day I was like, I'm gonna do a desert landscape. So that was one of my favorite practices ever. And I feel like looking at these, I want to start it up again because I really felt like my ability to sketch and just be confident in my sketches grew exponentially. Like it was so hard for the first month. And then after that point, I was like, oh, okay. I started to plan out in my head, like if these trees are this tall, before I started touching the pens to the page, I already kind of had an idea of where stuff went. But it also helped me just to kind of start surrendering some control and say, okay, like there should have been a whole other peak over here and I didn't get to it, and that's fine. This one I got really frustrated with and just put black lines on it. This day it was like 11 p.m. and I was tired. This day I was also tired. This day I was having much more fun with things. That day I was tired. So it becomes kind of like a visual journal of sorts, right? And that day I definitely was not feeling it. But it was, like I said, it was one of the best things I've ever done. And the tools I used for that was just a really simple, I used a fountain pen, and you could use a micron pen, but I was using so much ink that I really wanted a pen that I could refill. Then I also used a brush pen, which is this wonderful tool right here that allows you to make brush-like strokes on a page. You can do big, bold marks and little teeny tiny marks. And these also are a great way to kind of train ourselves to work with a paintbrush because the tip mimics that. So those are one of my favorite things too. Any last questions before I wrap us up for the evening?
What kind of art would you recommend a beginner to start working on? What kind of style?
I think I would say definitely do sketching, whether in pencil or pen, if you feel comfortable doing so. I love, like I mentioned, just trying to sketch without a pencil lines first. I think there's something so freeing if we let ourselves make mistakes about that practice. But in terms of landscapes, I really like landscapes that have a mix of rock and snow. because I like having that higher contrast between areas of rock and then areas of snow is like easier for my brain to wrap its head around, like wrap itself around and see. So I definitely recommend that. And then, just pick whatever you're inspired and excited about, because that's what you're going to stick with as you keep practicing. So I have some students who they love atmospheric ridgelines, and they just have a whole like folder full of Blue Ridge Mountains and North Cascades ridgelines, and they just practice painting ridgelines and looking at atmospheric perspective. I have others who love painting trees, and they'll just spend hours and hours learning how to do that and refining their techniques. And my next free workshop, I think, will actually be all about painting and sketching trees, because they're just such a wonderful and really difficult thing to sketch. So I've gotten some requests for that to be my next little mini workshop like this. But yeah, mostly just choose what you're interested in, because when we're just starting, the only way that we're going to keep painting is if we actually like the landscapes we're painting. So even if it feels complex, we're simplifying anyway. So just stick with it. And that's what I would encourage you to do. Like, I love the snowy Rocky Mountain landscapes. That was my first thing that I tried. And I did them in monochrome. I did them just in black and white. And I did that for like many, many months. Okay, I'll feel.
Really
Yeah, go
can I
ahead.
ask you a question really quick? I see on your palette that your like orange and yellow has some darker colors on it. After every painting, do you like go through and like clean that up, or how do you deal with that?
I aspire to. I don't always. So whenever my paints get contaminated, my palette looks way worse than this most of the year. Let's be honest. I just cleaned it recently for a video. So I just dip my paintbrush in clean water, and I kind of like agitate the paint, wipe it off, wipe off some more, wipe off the little edges. And I just try to get most of the paint. This works the best with clean water and not blue water. But you can see even with like really, really blue water, I can get that little yellow quite clean, just going between my paper towel and my paintbrush. And if I'm in the middle of a painting, I will often just try to keep one half of each little color cleaner. So I might have like a really dirty half that's all green up there, and the bottom half is where I go in if I want that more pure yellow color. So my palette ends up being kind of two-tone. And then when they get really, really dirty to the point where I have to refill them, like if they get really dished, you can see how that blue is kind of running a tiny bit low. When they get quite a bit more empty, then I'll pull each little pan out, and I'll grab usually a paintbrush like this, like a stiffer acrylic painting brush, and I'll just kind of run it under water and wipe out all the paint that is contaminated, let it all dry, and then refill it. So I only ever refill really, really clean little pans. Otherwise, I'm locking in that contaminated color. So yeah, basically I just end up like cleaning as I go until it gets to the point where it's just like, oh no, this is unusable. Then it takes like an hour to do everything. Okay. Well, thank you all so much. It was so fun to share this time with you, whether you were here live with me or you're going to be tuning in with the recording later. It's always so fun to connect with new folks. And I hope to see you in another class soon, whether it's my Adventure Art Academy lessons, or I'm actually doing a week from today, I'm doing a workshop on my story sketch pages. That was like the one I showed you with the text and the images. I'll be doing a different scene than this one, but actually I think, do I have it? Oh, where did I put it? I had the page somewhere. I did this a little while ago, but it'll be this same kind of format and talking about like, I'll demo a mountain scene and it'll be super fun. So I'll send you guys a link for that one as well, if you would like to do that. But thank you all. This has been so fun. I'm not going to bother turning my camera around because then I have to deal with backgrounds and all that fun things, but goodbye. Have a wonderful evening, and you'll be hearing from me soon.